Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. I recently got the new Simon Hurley solar paste, and in this video we're going to play with them a little bit. Now there's 6 colors total in the line. I've got 4 of them. The other 2 are a yellow and orange, and those are my least favorite colors, so I'm trying to be a more responsible crafter and not need to have complete collections and just buy what I know I'm actually going to use. So I'm just taking each one of the colors and I'm swatching them on some white cardstock as well as black cardstock. And you can see how they show up differently on each of the cardstocks. On the white cardstock, they're more of a subtle iridescent look, and on the black one, you see more of the color. So it's a great way to have one product that does different things on different backgrounds. It gives you a little bit more options when it comes to playing. We're a really nice creamy texture, and they were really easy to clean up. So the first way I'm going to use the paste is I'm going to use some black cardstock. I'm just taping it down. I'm going to tape a stencil over top of it, and I'm just going to put all of the colors through the stencil. Now I'm just going to do all of the colors, and I don't mind if they start mixing together. I want to see what they're going to look like through a stencil and how it's going to show up, how they're going to mix, combine, and what type of dimension we're going to get. And we ended up getting some really nice dimension. I have to add a little bit more paste in just a moment because I didn't have quite enough. So I'll add just a little bit more to finish up the background. I'm just keeping the paste even with the top of the stencil. That way I know I'm going to have a nice even surface once it's done. It does take a little while to dry, very similar to texture paste in the drying time, because you do have a little bit of a thickness there and it has to dry. So we have the one background done here. You want to make sure to clean off your stencils fairly quickly. You don't want to have your paste drying on your stencil. It's a lot easier to clean while it's wet, and definitely a lot more difficult and sometimes impossible once it's dry. So we're going to do the same thing on some white cardstock. I have a different stencil here just for a little bit of a different pattern. But once again, I'm going to do all 4 colors, getting a little bit of each one. This time I'm going to add a little bit more than I did last time, and it ends up being a little bit too much, but I have some scrap paper on the side. Any extra paste that I have left over on my palette knife, I'm just kind of cleaning my palette knife on some scrap cardstock, and I'm going to use that to do die cutting of embellishments. And just like before, I'm trying to blend the colors together a little bit. Because the paste itself is white, you don't see a whole lot of the individual colors while it's wet. You see them a lot more when they're dry. And by cleaning off that palette knife on those scrap pieces of paper, it's perfect for die cuts and embellishments. It cut right through them like butter. It was no problem at all. And you know you're going to have pieces that are going to coordinate perfectly with your backgrounds. So this is the backgrounds once they are done. They turned out absolutely beautiful, and I just love with this paste how you get 2 different looks with it with very little effort, and all you do is swap out the background color. So we're going to play with that difference between the black and white with this. I'm going to stencil on some white cardstock with some black ink, and then I'm just going to use my palette knife and smear the ink over the whole surface just to see the difference between the two with a background all on its own. Now I'm using a distress ink here, which is a dye-based ink, and I know that it does react to moisture and with water, so when I go and smear that paste on there, it's going to start to bleed and feather a tiny little bit. I know that's probably going to happen, and I'm totally fine with it. If you want to have a nice crisp stencil edge or behind it, you want to make sure to use some permanent ink so that that paste is not going to do that. I like how it kind of softened the pattern a little bit, but it's one of those things that if you don't want it to do that, just use some permanent ink and that will solve the issue right together. But I really like how on one background with this, you get the look of the difference between the paste on the black and on the white, and it just makes a really interesting background in my opinion. And once again, I'm using all 4 colors and I am blending them together. I like the look of all those colors blended together. You can, if you want, just use 1 color or 2 colors, however many you want, but I wanted to see all of them and see the result with all of them. This particular piece here where I'm putting the excess from the palette knife onto a scrap, I got a little bit of the black ink there, so there's a little bit of streaks in there, but it works fine for what I cut out with it. These little bits of the excess paste on the side are really kind of cool, and I've got an idea for it, so I'm going to do a future video with those. I'm going to play around with it and see if my idea works. So if there's a future video about it, you know it worked. So my next technique that I'm going to do the 3D embossing with the Roses embossing folder. I'm using some black watercolor cardstock. I want to make sure to have some nice, stiff, heavy cardstock to be able to support that 3D image, as well as to be able to easily put paste on it. If I use some thinner black cardstock, it would likely rip in that 3D embossing folder, and I don't want that to happen. I did mist that watercolor cardstock before putting it in the 3D folder, just to soften the paper fibers a little bit. The next technique I'm going to do, I'm going to stamp and emboss this butterfly as well as one of the sentiments from this stamp set, and then I'm going to try painting with that solar paste. Because it works really nicely on the black cardstock, I think it's going to create a really nice iridescent look to it, and I think this butterfly image is the perfect one for that. So I'm using my embossing powder tool and making sure to cover the whole paper with it, just to make sure that my embossing powder only sticks to my embossing ink and not the rest of the cardstock or any fingerprints I might have left. I'm pressing my stamp really firmly on that piece, and then I'm going to put some silver embossing powder on there. You could use whatever color you wanted. I wanted to have a nice silver on there. I thought it would look really nice with all of the colors that we're using. Make sure to tap off any of the excess embossing powder before heating it up with the embossing tool. And any excess embossing powder can go right back into the jar. No need to waste it. Next, I'm using an embossing tool to melt that powder. If you've never embossed before, you're going to notice that the powder goes from granular and dull to nice and shiny and smooth really quickly with an embossing tool. You definitely need a specific embossing tool for this. A hairdryer will not work. A hairdryer just blows air, and an embossing tool emits heat, so it'll heat up that powder right where it is. Now I'm going to take my solar paste and I'm going to use just a flat small brush. It's probably about 1/4 inch, maybe 1/2 inch, and I'm just taking a little bit of that paste from the lid and I'm just working from the outside of the wings to the inside. I'm going to transition from the blue to the purple to the pink, and then I'm going to do the body in the green just to get a little bit of each of the colors in there, and I want to have the colors going from one to the other. If you wanted and you only had a couple colors, you could absolutely just do a solid color or just do 2 colors. I like to see them all because I've got these pastes. I might as well use them as many colors as possible just to see exactly how they turn out. They were really, really easy to paint with, and I was interested to see how the paste would look on top of the embossing, but you actually don't really notice it. Similar to the solar paste on white cardstock, it's barely noticeable unless you shimmer it or shimmy it or tilt it into the light. I apologize. It's been a very long day and apparently English is getting a little bit hard. Because I'm putting just a thin coat of the solar paste on there with the water brush or with the flat brush, it doesn't take very long to dry at all. It dries really quite quickly. And that paper napkin I have to the side is just wet down with water. It's just to rub the brush off to clean it between the different colors. Probably could have left this piece with just the butterfly colored. I decided to try see what would happen or how it would look if I just had the colors transitioning between each other behind the sentiment stamp at the bottom. And it looked really quite nice. Not a step that's very necessary, but it's just, I was curious how it would look. I have all the supplies that I'm using as well as the colors listed and linked down in the description box below. So if there's anything that I forgot to mention, you're likely going to find that information down there. Simon Hurley also has a line of lunar paste, which is different from these solar pastes. The lunar pastes are more of a metallic look to them, and this has more of an iridescent interference look to it. And interference inks or micas tend to look different on white and dark, just like these do. So our piece of watercolor cardstock that was embossed with the 3D roses is ready. So I'm taking a little bit of each of the paste from the cap and I'm just tapping them onto my media surface mat here. And I'm just taking the excess off of my fingers so that I have a very little bit on my fingers. I want to be able to control how much I'm putting on. Less is more. I can always add more to it, but this isn't one of those things that you can't take any excess away if you accidentally put too much. So by tapping off the excess and making sure I only have a little bit on my fingers, I can control that a little bit better. So I first put the pink on the flowers, and now I'm putting just a touch of the purple in the center of the flowers. Next, I will do the green on the leaves. And I wasn't originally going to do the blue, but I ended up taking the blue out and just putting a little bit of the blue kind of on the base of some of the leaves, just to incorporate that and have that in there a little bit. You want to make sure, even though this is 3D embossed, you want to make sure to have a very light touch because it was very easy to accidentally get some on the background. I don't necessarily mind if there's a little bit on the background, and really most people wouldn't even notice it's there. But if that's something that bothers you, you want to be extra vigilant about it. And because we're using so little on our fingers, this is pretty much dry by the time I'm done this whole image. So there's not really much drying time here to wait for. This piece of cardstock here was a little bit bigger than I needed it to be, so I'm going to cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, just to make sure that it's a nice size for the front of the card and have a little bit of a mat around it. Now that our backgrounds are done, I'm going to do some die cutting and die cut some of the embellishments. So for the first one, I'm taking both a white background as well as a black background, and by background I mean some of the scraps that I cleaned my palette knife off of. I'm going to cut 2 different pieces from this detailed butterflies die. One is a solid image and one has openings in the wing, so you're going to be able to see a little bit of the solid one through that. And like I said before, they cut beautifully. It was like cutting through regular cardstock. You didn't even notice that there was paste or anything on the top of the cardstock. So it didn't interfere in any way, shape, or form with the die cutting. I'm also using those scraps to die cut some of the sentiments, and then I chose some coordinating cardstocks for both the card bases as well as the silhouettes around the sentiments. I'm using some Distress Collage Medium to glue them together. I love using Distress Collage Medium because it dries matte and it dries clear, so I don't have to worry about seeing any glue if any happens to seep out. And it also dries nice and quickly, which is fantastic. If any of these start to buckle because it is a liquid glue, I just put an acrylic block on there just to hold it down, keeping my hands free for the next thing. And with our embellishments ready, we're ready to start assembling our cards. So this is the background that I stenciled the black with the distress ink. I'm just gluing it to a coordinating blue card, and then I have a sentiment that has the same blue as the silhouette background. I'm going to put an acrylic block on that while it dries and then just set it aside. This one here, I'm going to just glue that to the card base and once again put it with an acrylic block on there just to hold it down while it's drying. The stencil I used for this background kind of looked a little bit like leaves to me, so I chose to die cut some leaves out of some of those solar paste smeared pieces, just to give it a coordinating shimmer to it, as well as tying in the die cuts to the background. Next we have our 3D embossed piece. Once again, I'm gluing it to my card base with some Distress Collage Medium, and then I just added a simple hello sentiment to the front. Because the 3D embossed background is so detailed and it's got so much dimension to it, I kind of think adding too much to it takes away. So a very simple sentiment is usually what I add to it. It doesn't really need a whole lot more than that. The next background is the one where we did the paste through the stencil on the white background, and I really love the iridescent shimmer to this. It would be really pretty as a floral background and do as a wedding card because it just kind of has that little bit of a vibe to it. I ended up choosing to do it as a birthday card. I just chose some coordinating cardstock scraps and cut out some balloons. That white one there is one of my scraps that I smeared some of the excess solar paste on. So it's got the coordinating iridescent shimmer as the background. And then the sentiment that I chose to add to it is just celebrate. I'm going to use some silver cord on these balloons just to give them a little bit of a tie, and I'm going to kind of swoop them so that they're secured behind where the sentiment is going. Before I secure those ties onto the card though, I'm securing them on the back of the balloons, and then I'm going to glue those balloons down and put an acrylic block on it to let them dry so that those are nice and secure before I complete the rest of the card. In order to secure the strings from the balloons, I'm just using a strip of 1/4 inch double-sided tape. I'm just going to put that strip across and then I will attach those strings to it. That Celebrate die cut, I'm going to use some Distress Collage Medium as well. That double-sided tape is likely going to hold the Celebrate die cut, but by putting the Distress Collage Medium on there as well, I can make sure that it's doubly secure once that glue has dried. The last background to turn into a card is our painted and embossed butterfly. And because that background is pretty much completely done, all I need to do is add glue to it and then put it back to the card base, put an acrylic block on it and let it dry completely. So these are our completed solar paste cards. I absolutely love this paste. I can't wait to play with it some more. I love seeing how it reacts with the different colored background. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a fantastic day.